Hey guys, Vinnie Mirchandani. A real pleasure to have Mike Ettling, CEO of Unit4. Unit4 is an ERP player with a bit of a difference. They focus a lot more on service sector industries, higher education, public sector, etc. And in addition, they have a fairly global footprint. So Mike's going to join me from Florida. He's a fellow Floridian, which is unusual because usually he is somewhere on a plane around the world. So Mike, welcome aboard and tell us a little bit about yourself and also answer a question. How long has it been since you've not gone on a plane this long? In my case, I think it's 1983. So.
Well, Vinny, great to join you and thanks for having me on the podcast. So to answer your first question, so it's now 15th of March when I stopped flying. But this hasn't been the longest I haven't been on a plane because, growing up in South Africa, I first got on a plane when I was 18 years old. So I've got a long time to go still before I beat my record of not being on a plane.
That's cheating. That's cheating in your professional life.
So
tell us a little bit about your background. Tell us a little bit about Unit4.
Okay, how do I describe my background? In 2 minutes, started life as a CPA, strayed off into technology, and worked for little technology companies and big ones like EDS. Still have the 2 original copies of McCracken's COBOL and McCracken's Fortune on my desk.
Hey, the state unemployment office wants you.
Yeah, I know. It's like suddenly been in demand now. I was thinking of dusting it off. And then, I like to joke that after straying into technology, I became an accountant who found a personality and got into HCM. When I became CEO of Northgate Arinza, only to realize HCM and payroll are very different worlds. And I learned the hard way about payroll, where you're only as good as the last incorrect check you cut for a customer.
Oh boy.
And then went on to run SAP SuccessFactors and now Unit4. So you might ask, well, why Unit4 in that context? I think what interested me was, having been in the HCM and human capital space with Northgate Arinza and SuccessFactors, I got really interested in Unit4's strapline, which says "in business for people." And what I started realizing was that when you build ERP for people-based businesses, it's quite fundamentally different to how you build ERP for manufacturing-based businesses. And most of the ERPs out there have a manufacturing heritage in terms of where they started.
Right.
And there's very few ERPs, you probably can count them on one hand, who've started and said, we're not going to do manufacturing. We're going to focus on people-based businesses, whether it's consultants or accounting firms or lawyers, construction firms, but your main asset and resource is people. So that really got me interested in Unit4. And when I looked at the market space, I look at the landscape as you've got your enterprise ERP players and you've got your mid-market players, where we sit with lots of others. But then if you do draw this distinction and say, put all the manufacturing ones to one side and the people-based ERP to the other, there's only a few of us. And when you look at the mid-market, we're the largest player in that space. So I really liked that idea. I knew the investors, the private equity firm which owns Unit4, Advent. I've known them for years, really a class in PE firm. And I felt, yeah, there's something which could be done with this. This is more than an ERP, because people experience, employee experience is so important in people-based businesses. So, and you change that not by taking your grandfather's ERP and surrounding it with HCM technology from the West Coast. You change that by changing the ERP, because most people in people-based businesses spend more of their time in the core ERP. You've got to establish a project, you've got to look at billability, you've got to resource it, you've got to look at utilization, you've got to build a customer, you've got milestone recognition, all that good stuff. It's all in ERP, integrated ERP. So that's what got me really interested in it. And I joined April the 15th, and I'm just past my first anniversary.
Thanks, Mike. So talking about people, I know you have, employees in several hotspots, right? The UK is not faring too well. Netherlands has had a fairly significant outbreak and so on. Are your employees doing okay?
Yeah, we've had, I think we moved very quickly to work from home, very effectively. We've had 5 employees who've had coronavirus or recovered. No mortality in the Unit4 family. But so, yeah, our employees are doing well. And I think they've shown incredible resilience and tenacity. We've just, finished our Q1. We hit all our numbers in Q1 despite the world shutting down. So I think, we've shown incredible tenacity to say, okay, let's figure out how we make this work. And a lot of it came down to, fortunate enough to have business operations in Asia Pacific. So it almost gave you a little bit of a peek preview into what was coming. And my APJ leader, who's based in Singapore, said on one call, my best advice to all of you, given we're 6 weeks ahead, is just get on with it, figure out your new normal as quickly as possible, and make it work. Don't get bogged down in the actual process of now the change sort of thing. And the quicker you can define the new normal, the better. And that was a penny drop moment for us as a leadership team, where we said, yeah, that's it. We're now working from home. This is not about COVID. This is a recession. What do we now do? How do we ensure the wellness of our people? How do we manage for a recession? And that was our mantra from, 15th of March.
Mike, talking about leadership, given that you're global, there's obviously an American style that you're used to. I talked to somebody recently and they said, you need a wartime leader for this, right? What subtle changes do you have to make, given that you have a more global employee base, customer base? Is it very different?
So let me pick up on one point you made, because I do take objection to the comparison of this to needing wartime leadership. This isn't a war.
Wait a minute.
This is a health crisis.
He said it is a war against the virus, right?
Yeah, but I think the dynamics you need as a leader in this type of world is a huge amount of empathy, which is not necessarily the case in terms of wartime leaders. So I think that's one of the first things which all leaders have to figure out. I think the second most important thing, and we've been doing a lot of coaching with our people and my top 100 leaders over this last 6 weeks, is I said up front to everyone, I think the single biggest determinant of our success at Unit4, it's not going to be how well we do the plans and whatever. It's going to be a simple thing, which is how well can my leaders play offense and defense simultaneously? Because it's not a natural thing for leaders to do. Leaders, either defer to defense. You've got defensive leaders who take cost out. You've got offensive leaders who grow. But I now need leaders to do both. And I need leaders to figure out what are the defenses we're building, and immediately build them. But at the same time, we're going for our number. We're not looking at reduced numbers. We're going for the target. How do we be offensive? So we've done things like we have an offensive plan and we have a defensive plan. And the offensive plan has got things on it like repurpose receptionists to lead generation, repurpose recruiters, because we're slowing down recruiting, to lead gen and demand gen activities. So that to me is the single biggest thing. I don't think, yes, there are stylistic differences between how European leaders lead and US leaders lead. But I think I think this crisis is actually bringing the stylistic differences together and converging them. It's not enhancing them, because everyone's got to be focused on their people. So people and the wellness of your people and how do you make this work is becoming the single focus, and the differences are falling, by the side in terms of how you deal with it.
Let's talk about industries. We've obviously seen a lot of acrobatics and heroics in healthcare, right? Frontline, frenzied vaccine development, clinical trials getting expedited, manufacturing, somersaults where auto companies are making ventilators, and 3M is quadrupling N95 mass production, last mile logistics, phenomenal, right? Drive-throughs overnight, just all kinds of acrobatics. You're more in the service sector. Tell us about some acrobatics you've seen from your customers.
Yeah, so some of our verticals are education, higher education,
right,
which has been a vertical which has taken a lot of pressure under this, through the situation, and probably was caught off guard a lot because they're not as digitized as a lot of other verticals. But then we're seeing, just tremendous focus in educational institutions who we service around, repurposing people on campuses to actually manufacture. One of our university clients has a fashion technology institute. They're all manufacturing masks and PPE for local hospitals and healthcare. Huge amount of focus on research and how they're mobilizing research and building partnerships with pharmaceutical companies around research. And then we also have a lot of clients in the not-for-profit space.
right.
And, the not-for-profits, one would think have been hit, but actually people's generosity and donor and giving has increased through this period. So most of our not-for-profits are actually scaling up operations and, heavily engaged in operations. We've got one not-for-profit who's very focused on vulnerable children and vulnerable communities. And they're doing an incredible amount of work around how to support vulnerable children in this type of environment. Where often the normal things of kids going to school protect them from vulnerability, now they're exposed to it all day. So we're seeing a lot of phenomenal efforts in, not the frontline industries, but the support industries around the frontline, doing incredible things.
That's great to hear. One of the things I've heard from a number of CIOs is their cloud solutions have helped them in the move to work from home much more than their on-premise, right? You didn't have to go through tunnel through VPNs and stuff like that. What's been your experience, and given the change expectations and volumes that you're seeing in your customer base, how have your systems coped? Have you had to do somersaults, or has it been a reasonably easy transition?
Look, it's been, so we are, the classic on-prem to cloud journey. We are now about 50% cloud of our recurring revenues, and 50% is still maintenance. So we pretty much at passing that tipping point. But what is really interesting is that, firstly, from a customer perspective, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think customers who've made the shift to the cloud, and when I say cloud, whether it's a vendor cloud, application in a vendor cloud, or whether it's they've taken something on premise and they've put it into a hyperscaler type world, I think those organizations are, did have an advantage through this. And the resilience was there. The ability to scale up and scale down was absolutely there. We run our cloud customers all in Azure, in multiple Azure centers around the world. And, we've seen better availability and uptime over this period, and part of that philosophy was we took an approach which said, this is going to be a recession. In a recession, customers are less tolerant of mistakes. So how do we improve our quality? So how do we get less downtime, so even going above where we have to be from an SLA perspective. So I think cloud has been a big advantage. We're also seeing, particularly in our local government vertical, where, local governments have always had a kind of GDPR plus data residency mentality, particularly in Europe. So it's not good enough just to be GDPR compliant. You must also, and have your data center in the EU, you must have it in my country, sort of thing. Those objections are disappearing really fast. So we're starting to see dialogues with customers who were, we can't go to your cloud because there's no data center yet in our country, now saying, if you've got one in the EU and it's secure, we want to go.
Wow. It's nice that you say that, because we've seen so many objections for the last 20 years just disappear overnight, right? I'm sure you're seeing it in your professional services groups. I mean, they used to resist working from home or working from a remote office, and suddenly now they're being forced to. So yeah, it's 10 years of change in 2 months. Let's go back to your industries: higher education, public sector, and even your HR. What will be the new normal? I mean, it just seems like, to the previous point about things changing overnight, right? Governments saying, forget about HIPAA. You can do telemedicine, right? Just like that. Suddenly we've gotten telemedicine take off. What are you finding what do you think is going to happen to your different verticals?
So if we look at ourselves, our own professional services function inside Unit4 and how that is changing through this, I think it's going to change the professional services world very dramatically. And the need, the days of the airplane warrior consultant, I think are going to be gone, because we saw very quickly that we had a number of contracts where the obligation was for on-site implementations, resources on site. Within 24 hours, all of those obligations were waived by customers, even though they were contractual. We have had probably 5 customers who've come to us and said, we need to stop, we can't do our project, out of all of our customers. So projects and implementations have continued. In Q1, we brought 100 customers live. So we're not seeing a slowdown. So I think the shift, in professional services, where I want to touch the consultant, I want to see the consultant, and consultants wanted to be on premise, I think that's going to change dramatically. So much more to 1 or 2 people on premise, rest in back offices, configuration offices. So I think that's going to change dramatically. The higher education space is, we think it's going to go through a lull, a quiet, but then come back very aggressively, because, we saw higher education as being largely caught a bit flat-footed, not digitized enough. So there's been a big scramble now just to get distance learning capability in place, to get Zoom up and Teams and those sort of things. And if you think about your alma maters, it's a place where people go to work, and the professor's office and all that. It's not designed or built around a remote work type environment. But we think once they get through that, there's going to be a massive surge to how do we digitize and accelerate and catch up so we're not caught out again. I think the bigger challenge in higher education, and I think this is a pretty global phenomenon, pretty prevalent in the US, particularly in the mid-market sector. If you think of whether it's a not-for-profit university or for-profit, 5,000 students, that sort of bracket, many of those institutions, their break-even or their profit is determined by the foreign student fees. And the foreign student market is basically dried up, and I think will be dried up, might be for a year, 2 years sort of thing. There certainly is not going to be foreign students enrollment for 2021. So I think the sustainability of many higher education institutions is going to be challenged, because that real high profit student, it's like an airline losing all its business class passengers, essentially. It's what's happening in higher education.
So how is that going to, are they going to be the two sectors you talked about? Are they looking for additional functionality from you as a result? Or do you have enough, whatever you have can be repurposed for their changes?
Yeah, so what we're doing in student management, we have enough functionality, and I think the focus is going to shift around how the competition for students is going to become greater, and it's going to become a bit of a student market, in the sense that the students will have, universities are going to compete more to get students, because it's going to become so critical now. But in a more generic answer to your comment is that one of the things I said to my teams about 4 weeks ago was, to my product leadership, we need to tear up our roadmaps. We need to relook at our roadmaps, because what we thought we should build for the next 4 quarters and what this is going to do is going to, by necessity, change the roadmap. So we need to get ahead of it. And I think there's 2 dimensions for why. Number one is, if you go back and look at any of the great recessions, so early 90s, you had the way technology is consumed post the recession changes. So early 90s, it was the client server wave. And then you had the 2000 recession, and you had internet and mobile. And then you had 07, 08, and you had cloud. So what's the next big shift in technology consumption? And I think the other big dynamic is what I call the landing page migration. So, 6 weeks ago, my landing page on my Apple, whenever I was working, was Mail. Mail was up, top of mind, on top of all the windows, 90% of the time. Today, it's Microsoft Teams or Zoom. So now, in my Microsoft Teams, I've got on the left where it says calendar and whatever, I have Unit4 Wonder, which is our conversational chatbot, which I can ask to do things and prompt things. So I think this whole move, we've been talking about this for 5-6 years around conversational UI, the concept that no one's going to log into ERP anymore. You're going to be prompted, event-driven, to do stuff. I think this whole process is going to accelerate it. And that's why roadmaps have to change.
That's a great point. Warren Buffett did his annual meeting on Saturday virtually for the first time. I mean, it's a big event for him to have people come to Omaha, but they had to do it virtually. And he's 89, and he presented slides for the first time, he said, in his life. And then he said Charlie Munger, his longtime partner, who was 96, said Charlie's become a Zoom fanatic. So,
Yeah.
Yes, it is a new world when senior citizens are also changing. So as you can imagine, the millennials and all that will definitely expect different, touchless screens and so on. I mean, just a very different sense of hygiene and work culture. Put on your financial hat. I'm asking everyone, do you see a V recovery, sharp rebound? Do you see a slow U? Do you see a W, kind of choppy, up and down? Or do you see an L? It's going to be dead for a while.
Yeah. I'll answer this in a little bit of a roundabout way. So when we did sat down with the team and said, how are we going to deal with this? We decided to take a leaf out of the Dutch history books, given our heritage was Dutch. And we said to everyone, no one on my team is allowed to do scenario planning. Scenario planning is forbidden. Only my CFO and I will do some scenario planning. What everyone is going to do is we need to get together as a team and figure out what dikes we're going to build. And we all took the pledge that the last dike will be layoffs. So we don't want to do layoffs during this. but what are all the dikes we're going to build and implement immediately, regardless of what you think the waves are going to be. And my whole philosophy about this is that if people spend their time trying to guess, is it a little wave, a big wave, a tsunami, a hurricane, you know, V, W, Y, or L, they'll talk themselves into one of the scenarios, and it will likely not be that scenario. So we maintain this approach which said, we have a budget, everyone focus on how you're going to get to your budget. Yes, there might be gaps and challenges now, but that's your job, is to figure out how you're going to get to that number. We mapped out a dike strategy of about 15, 20 dikes, and we implemented it straight away. So we're not waiting to see what size wave it is, we just implemented it straight away. And we hope for that, you know, if we don't get the big waves, if we get a V, we'll be in a better position than we thought at the beginning of the year. You know, depending what it is, we'll have enough dikes to protect the business. And that approach has actually worked really well for us. And then focusing a lot on the offensive, you know, how do we hit the number tactics of shifting resources to go work on, you know, receptionists working in lead generation type of activities. So I've kind of dodged the question a little bit.
No,
because,
I think you focused your team on being tactical, right? But you and your CFO can be a little more strategic. So now you can answer my question. Now that from a strategy perspective, are you optimistic? Are you pragmatic?
Look, I am very optimistic, but I do think the return. So I think the shape of the recovery is going to be very different country to country. Very, very different, because some countries have had very little trauma as a result of this.
Right.
And the thing I've been looking at across all our countries is trying to get a sense of the trauma, which was looking at what is the hospital and intensive care bed capacity and where was the curve. And, you know, we operate in countries where the capacity was here and the curve was way down. You know, they never, at their peak, they never hit 20% of their capacity. We're operating in other countries where, you know, 70% of the curve breach capacity all the time. And I think that's going to determine the shape of the return. So we are gearing up very much for a very different economic picture country to country in terms of which we operate. We're trying to focus resources, sales energy into the countries we think are recovering faster, you know, and shift from countries where we think it's going to take longer to countries which are going faster. And I think that's what, you know, everyone needs to think about, particularly for global companies. It's not going to be a global recovery.
I think that's a great point, Mike. And you know, that's true of the US too, right?
50 countries.
Sitting in Florida, we, like you say, our ICU needs were way down here compared to models. And New York, on the other hand, is like Spain and Italy. I mean, it's,
yeah.
So yeah, that's a great point actually it's going to be very region specific. Mike, what else? You have so much experience in the industry. What would you tell your peers, both on the buyer side and on the vendor side? Share some more of your wisdom.
You know, I think,
give away all your secrets.
You know, Vinnie, I think what's the most interesting aspect right now, which a lot of companies are grappling with, and us as well, is the return to work. And I think in many ways,
from an HR perspective, actually speak about that, because a lot of people are grappling with, you know, distancing and temperature checks and all that. Have you been helping your customers think through that?
Well, yeah, you know, so I think the easy part of this was actually the lockdown, because it was binary, and it was, you know, governments passed orders and laws, and you had to lock down and figure it out. And it was a clear end game you were working to. I think the challenge with this, the return to work, is that there are just so many variables to consider. And, you know, the different legislation by state, by country, it makes global payroll legislation look simple. The way this is going to emerge. So we were kind of having a little bit of a off-the-wall thought about this, which says, is it actually possible? We were going down the path of, let's design a return-to-work model, Unit4 work, so that as countries open the doors, people come back, there's a model they can adopt and work into. Then we started looking at, but there's going to be this exception and this rule, and then we got employees who are saying, I'm not going back to work till there's a vaccination, you can't force them. We started thinking this is going to actually be too complex. You'll end up writing books and manuals this thick to do it. So then we said, well, why don't we turn this on its head? And instead of trying to build a return to work model, why don't we just say the new work model for Unit4 is work from home? And you have you have offices where you can go and drop in and socialize and take clients to and do different things, and proper health and safety enforced, proper social distancing, you can get your social interaction. But instead of trying to figure out this myriad of complex, it's almost like the problem is too complex and too many variables to actually practically solve. So let's change the problem and say, well, the standard work policy is work from home. So we're actually seriously exploring that at the moment.
You really simplified the problem. But your customers, though, are they asking you to convene, like higher education, probably want to adopt your model, right? They still want to go back to campus. Are you helping them with their new workplace, new hygiene kind of concepts, or are they doing that on their own?
They're doing that largely on their own. There's a lot of sharing going on. I think one of the really positive things out of this environment is just, there was no textbook for this. So the degree of peer engagement, CEO to CEO, CHRO to CHRO in forums, in different networks. I chose 2 CEO forums, one which I'm a member of and one which an investment banker created during this. And I've been on those calls every week and they've been extremely valuable. And the degree of sharing, no ego, what have you done? What have you done? Oh, that's interesting. Let me think about that. It's been hugely valuable. And I think that's happening in many levels in an organization. And, I think it's really important. I've encouraged my leaders to, get into their peer groups, to get ideas and share ideas. That's
good to hear. Look, there's so much doom and gloom. I'm looking at all the positives that are coming out of this, and we're gonna, in a number of ways, we're gonna be much better off coming out of this. Or at least you can hope for that. Any final thoughts, Mike?
Well, Vinnie, like you, I'm always optimistic. I think there's a tragic side to this, which we all need to be empathetic to. But there's also a lot of positives which, come out of this. And I think as humans, we need to seize the positives and focus on the positives and figure out how, we go forward with it. So I read an article recently which kind of said, imagine you were born in 1900. And, by the time you were 13, there was the First World War. And then by the time you were 29, there was the Great Recession, and there was a plague somewhere in between there. And then by the time you were 39, there was a Second World War. And then by the time you were, 50, there was the Korean War. And it kind of traced this person who lived to 85 and what they went through. And for most people today, this is probably the first major global traumatic event ever. And the trauma is largely we've had to sit on our sofas for 6 weeks. So I think there's a lot of positive to take out of it. And, unfortunately, mass media and the speed of media today always amplifies the negative far more aggressively and faster than the positive, and the positive is never always a good story. So, I stopped watching the mass media channels at the start of this, and I read for my news. I don't watch the TV.
I don't even read the news. I talk to people like you. Every conversation with a C-level executive tends to be like this, right? In social media, everything is negative and all the negative is magnified. So I'm glad we can talk person to person this way. Looking forward to sitting down with you sometime in the near future.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. Stay safe. And yeah, sooner or later, we'll have to get on that plane.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll be able to drive to you soon and we can sit down that way.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Mike.
Take care, Vinnie. Stay well.